When stepping into a dealership, many people may still believe that the brand-new, shiny SUVs in front of them will soon find an owner. But if you look a little closer, you might notice certain models that seem to have been sitting there for quite some time, almost becoming a familiar part of the lot. And it appears that the story behind these SUVs that never get sold is more complicated and quieter than what buyers are usually told. Perhaps one of the most persistent misunderstandings lies in the very moment a brand new SUV is delivered onto a dealer's lot. From the outside, everything seems finished. The vehicles are clean, unused, neatly lined up under the sun. It feels as if the money has already been paid, and all that remains is to wait for the right buyer to show up. Nothing seems urgent. Nothing appears to be slipping away. Seen this way, the assumption sounds reasonable enough. But if one lingers a little longer, it becomes easier to sense that another story may be unfolding quietly behind those motionless rows of vehicles. The moment an SUV's tires touch the lot, it seems as though an invisible clock begins to run. It makes no sound and gives no warning, yet it moves steadily, day after day. And time, as many people learn after decades of work, debt, and careful juggling, rarely shows much patience for things that remain still for too long. During the first 60 to 90 days, everything usually looks calm. Inventory interest appears manageable, sometimes even supported. Financial pressure does not yet show clearly on the surface. The lot stays full. Staff continue greeting customers, and daily operations seem normal. There are no obvious signs that a problem is forming. This period often creates a very convincing sense of safety. Perhaps because nothing hurts yet, it becomes easy to believe there is nothing to worry about. Prices do not need adjusting. Strategies do not need changing. Let it sit a little longer sounds like a reasonable, even cautious choice, at least at that moment. Once the 90-day mark passes, each unsold day seems to carry more than a single layer of cost. Not a sudden shock that forces attention, but many small expenses stacking quietly. Enough to make the financial equation feel less comfortable. At its core, the vehicle may still be tied to a loan. Interest rates tend to respond to broader market conditions over time. When the financial environment tightens, that number may no longer stay still. What is notable is that a dealer may not need to sell at a loss to start losing money. Simply by remaining unsold, the vehicle seems to generate cost on its own. Insurance adds another layer. A new vehicle in inventory must remain fully covered against risk. This expense does not shrink just because the car is not moving. It adds no value, does not make the vehicle more appealing to buyers. Yet it must be paid consistently. This may be one of the least visible costs, the cost of keeping everything exactly as it is. Then there is storage and upkeep. A lot does not run itself. Staff must monitor, organize, and move vehicles around. Batteries need charging, and basic checks still need to be done. Every small action consumes time and resources. It may sound slightly ironic, but cars are designed to be driven, not carefully maintained in a prolonged state of stillness. And perhaps the most subtle cost lies in market psychology. Even if a vehicle has never been driven on the road, time still leaves a mark on perception. A question seems to arise naturally. Why is this car still here? Is there something about it that does not quite fit? Even without a clear answer, the sense of value may have already shifted. Sometimes it fades before the sticker price ever changes. And along with it, the dealer's negotiating leverage may also seem to thin out, month by month. When it comes to discounts on new vehicles, many people may still picture them as a proactive, almost generous move by dealers. But if one observes long enough, it becomes apparent that discounts are rarely the first step. They tend to appear only after the initial waiting period has passed, when the roughly 90-day mark is no longer a theoretical idea, but begins to show up clearly in the numbers. The first and most visible tool dealers usually use is a direct reduction in the sticker price. At the beginning, the cut is often quite cautious, like a test of market reaction. Perhaps just a few $1,000s enough to create the feeling that an adjustment has been made, but not enough to change the nature of the equation. If the vehicle still fails to find a buyer, those reductions tend to increase over time. What is worth noting is that these early cuts, in many cases, seem only sufficient to offset part of the accumulated interest costs, rather than truly touching the depreciation that the market has quietly placed on the vehicle. Alongside price cuts come promotional packages and added incentives. Free maintenance, extra services, or added perks can sound appealing. In essence, these incentives raise perceived value without cutting too deeply into the sticker price. They may make the buying decision feel easier on a psychological level, but on closer inspection, buyers may notice that promotions, while convenient, rarely address the root issue of excess inventory. The vehicle remains there, and the question of why it has not sold does not disappear. Another commonly used tool is financial incentives. Lower interest rates or supported financing make monthly payments appear lighter. This can be particularly effective for those who focus on monthly costs rather than total ownership cost. However, from a longer-term perspective, a cheaper loan may not help the vehicle hold its value any better in the future. The remaining value of the vehicle still seems to be dictated by the market, not by the original financing terms. There is one thing that is often not stated very clearly during these discount periods. They rarely come from generosity or a sudden burst of goodwill. Instead, they appear to be the result of accumulated financial pressure, limited lot space being tied up for too long, and cash flow that cannot rotate as expected. In that sense, discounts resemble a defensive move rather than a reward for the buyer. For older buyers, there is a particular factor that deserves sober attention: instant depreciation. A previous model year vehicle, even if it has never been driven, already seems old in the eyes of the market. The moment the paperwork is signed, its value may already be weighed against newer model year vehicles or used vehicles in the same segment. Depreciation, in this case, may not occur when you drive off the lot, but when you agree to buy a model year, the market has already begun to leave behind. This is where the trap of discounted, but not enough often appears. Buyers may tell themselves, "It's already discounted, so it must be fine." But if that discount is not enough to cover the dealer's interest costs, not enough to compensate for model year depreciation, and not enough to offset future liquidity risk, then that gap seems to be transferred quietly to the buyer. The comparison may feel familiar to anyone who has lived through multiple economic cycles. It is like buying a house in an area that has already declined in value. The price may be lower than at the peak, but liquidity is weaker, and resale is no longer easy. Or like buying clearance inventory from a store that is about to close. Discounts are necessary, but not every discount is reasonable. After a period of discounting with the SUV still sitting on the lot, the story seems to take a different turn. At this point, simply hanging another sign offering a few $1,000s off may no longer be persuasive, while inventory costs continue to accumulate quietly day by day. And perhaps here, a turning point decision is made. Instead of letting the vehicle continue to sit on display, the dealer begins to let it be used. The most common path for these SUVs is becoming service loaner vehicles. When customers bring their cars in for maintenance, they are given another vehicle to use temporarily, and the slow-selling SUV suddenly becomes a perfect candidate. For the dealer, this appears to bring a few clear benefits. The vehicle is put into regular operation, and in some cases, the manufacturer may support part of the cost of the loaner program. On the surface, financial pressure seems somewhat reduced. Another path is becoming a test drive or demo vehicle. These vehicles are often used for longer than usual driving experiences, sometimes across different driving conditions. In theory, this is a good way for customers to understand the product, but in reality, demo vehicles rarely have only one driver. Each drive, each test, however brief, seems to leave small traces that future buyers may not immediately see. There are also cases where vehicles are assigned to employees or managers for daily use. The purpose sounds reasonable: building familiarity with the product and helping sales staff speak more convincingly. However, usage in these situations is often inconsistent. Not everyone drives the vehicle with the mindset of a long-term owner, and perhaps this also contributes to the vehicle's usage history becoming more complex than its appearance suggests. Behind these decisions, there seem to be two core objectives. The first is easing financial pressure. When vehicles are placed into certain usage programs, dealers may receive some cost support or at least soften the burden of inventory interest. Still, this appears to be more of a stopgap than a comprehensive solution to slow sales. The second objective, perhaps even more important, is preparing for a reclassification of the vehicle. Once the SUV has a few hundred or a few thousand miles on the odometer, the dealer can more easily label it as a demo vehicle or lightly used. This framing helps justify deeper discounts and makes the lower price easier to explain to buyers. On paper, the vehicle may still be unregistered, but in reality, it has passed through multiple users and operating situations. For buyers, especially those with many years of automotive experience, the risk does not necessarily lie in obvious major problems. It more often comes from early wear that is hard to see, suspension components that have worked harder, brakes that have experienced different driving styles, tires and interiors that may have been stressed unevenly. These are not necessarily serious issues, but they can influence the vehicle's true value over time. At some point, perhaps quietly, the options within a single dealership begin to run out. That SUV seems to have been discounted more than once, may have served as a test drive vehicle, or quietly become a loaner when customers brought their cars in for service. And when none of those approaches create real movement, the dealer starts looking beyond its own lot. The decision to transfer a vehicle to another dealership is rarely framed in negative terms. On paper, the reasoning sounds perfectly sensible. One market differs from another. Climate varies. Terrain varies. Driving habits are not the same. It seems reasonable that a configuration that sells slowly here might fit better somewhere else. A four-wheel drive SUV may be expected to do better in regions with long winters. A larger configuration might breathe more easily in suburban areas. When dealers within the same brand network begin to swap inventory, the vehicle does not actually leave the system. It simply changes location from one lot to another, from one city to the next. Hope is repackaged, but the vehicle itself remains the same. From that moment, the first layer of cost begins to appear. The vehicle must be loaded onto specialized transport and moved hundreds, sometimes thousands, of miles. There are transportation fees. There is insurance throughout the journey. These costs seem to add no new value to the vehicle itself. Then come the less visible factors. Each loading and unloading, each move around a lot, each period of temporary storage can leave very small marks behind. A minor scratch, a bit of tire wear, light but repeated stress on the suspension. None of this shows clearly on the odometer. What is mentioned less often is the pressure on the receiving dealership. They do not just receive another SUV, they receive another problem to solve. A slow-moving vehicle takes up display space. A difficult configuration forces adjustments to the overall inventory strategy. Sometimes, a single vehicle like this can slow the turnover of an entire small lot. When an SUV is sent to an auction, it often suggests that the door to official retail sales has nearly closed. Not because the dealer lacks patience, but perhaps because continuing to hold the vehicle only extends the cost. At this stage, sending a vehicle to auction tends to look like a strategic move, choosing to close the books rather than continue funding an expensive hope. The moment the vehicle passes through the doors of the auction house is also when its identity seems to change. Before that, it was still retail inventory. Even if slow selling, once it enters the auction, the vehicle no longer appears as a showroom product, but more like an asset to be liquidated. Here, value is not only about physical condition, but heavily shaped by the context in which it is offered. The auction's perspective on a vehicle is very different from that of a showroom. Buyers there are usually not looking for the feeling of owning a new vehicle. They are looking for margin. They focus on how quickly the vehicle can be turned, how much spread there is for resale, and what risks they may have to carry next. In this environment, emotion seems to step aside, making room for cold numbers. As a result, price reductions can happen much faster than many expect. Starting prices are often significantly lower than prior retail prices. Discounts of several tens of % off MSRP may sound shocking, but likely not because the vehicle suddenly became poor in quality. It is simply that the trading environment has completely changed. What was once sold with storytelling and showroom lighting is now sold on speed and capital recovery. Prices can fall that quickly in part because of how auction buyers view risk. They understand that if they take the vehicle home and cannot sell it, they will be the ones carrying the next inventory cycle. For that reason, they demand a large enough safety margin. The low price, in this case, seems to reflect risk more than the vehicle itself. For the dealer sending the vehicle to auction, this decision usually comes with accepting a loss on the books. The original investment may not be fully recovered. In exchange, however, cash flow is freed up and a long chain of ongoing costs comes to an end. For anyone who has ever run a business, this may sound familiar. Cutting losses early can sometimes be the least costly choice over the long run. At a certain point, when most of the previous options appear to have lost their effectiveness, selling vehicles through fleet channels begins to emerge as a more controlled exit. Discounts no longer seem strong enough to stimulate demand. Moving vehicles between dealerships appears to extend time without improving sales velocity. Auctions, while effective at clearing inventory quickly, can leave behind figures that are not particularly comfortable on the balance sheet. In that context, fleet sales are often viewed as a cleaner way to close the issue. The appeal of fleet sales lies in the fact that dealerships are no longer required to persuade individual retail buyers one by one. Instead, large volumes of vehicles can be moved in a short period of time, freeing up lot space and generating real cash flow. However, this tends to look more like a short-term tactical decision than a long-term strategy. It addresses immediate pressure but may not eliminate the consequences that appear later. These vehicles are typically sold to rental companies or corporate fleets. For rental operators, the primary focus seems to be volume and utilization over the vehicle's life cycle, rather than the image of being brand new. Lower purchase prices align well with a business model where rapid depreciation is already built into the calculations. For corporate fleets, vehicles are simply operational tools. The key concern is cost per year of use, not preserving resale value. What fleet buyers tend to have in common is an acceptance of depreciation as an unavoidable part of the equation. They do not carry the same psychological burden as individual buyers, who often associate a vehicle with a sense of ownership and expectations of long-term value. In fleet use, the vehicle appears to be little more than a cost line spread over time. In the short term, the benefits for dealers and manufacturers can be fairly clear. Inventory is cleared almost immediately. Cash flow returns to help cover floor plan interest and operating expenses. Short-term reports look easier to manage as the number of idle vehicles drops. Pressure from banks or manufacturers may ease as well. But these benefits seem to last only for a relatively brief cycle, because after 1 to several years, those fleet vehicles typically return to the market as used vehicles, and they do not return individually. They come back in batches, with similar configurations, competitive pricing, and large supply. A supply rebound effect begins to appear. Buyers gain access to more lower-priced options, and overall used vehicle price levels across the market appear to be pulled downward. Vehicles that end up in this state often share a few common traits. They appear to have gone through multiple rounds of price reductions without generating sufficient sales momentum. Or their configuration and color do not quite align with prevailing tastes in that particular region. They are not necessarily bad vehicles, just no longer aligned with the right moment. And in an industry where timing can matter as much as the product itself, that can be enough to change how a vehicle is treated. From here, long-term inventory usually follows one of several familiar paths. Some vehicles are moved to outdoor storage lots, transfer yards, or areas with limited customer access. The primary objective seems to be reducing display and operating costs rather than selling quickly. Others may be exported to different markets where standards, preferences, or product cycles do not fully overlap. This often comes with adjustments to how the vehicle is commercially positioned, and some vehicles are handled internally, allocated to purposes no longer closely tied to the concept of new retail sales, or simply held while waiting for a moment that appears more financially favorable. At this stage, there is a technical reality that is rarely discussed. Vehicles are designed to be driven regularly, not to remain stationary for extended periods. When a vehicle sits unused for a long time, certain natural processes still continue. Auxiliary batteries may gradually weaken. Rubber components, seals, and hoses are affected by time and environmental conditions. Oils and technical fluids may no longer be in the same optimal state as they were initially. These changes are often not obvious on the surface and do not immediately create the impression that something is wrong, but they exist as a form of quiet wear. This creates a subtle distinction between being new on paper and new in practice. Legally, the vehicle may still be unregistered, without an owner, and therefore classified as new. But in terms of use and feel, time spent sitting still may have created some distance from its original condition. Certain driving characteristics may need time to wake up again. This does not mean the vehicle is of poor quality, but it may change how buyers should think about its value. By this point, many people may begin to realize that brand new SUVs that fail to sell do not really disappear. Instead, they quietly move through different layers of the system, where their value is viewed in different ways. This seems to say less about the vehicle itself and more about market cycles and expectations. So, in your view, what criteria should buyers use when thinking about a new car to avoid disappointment later on? Share your perspective in the comments below.